The Italian game begins with the first move, pawn to e4, to which your opponent responds symmetrically with pawn to e5. You then continue with knight to f3, attacking the central pawn. Black defends, typically with knight to c6, and you develop your bishop to c4, placing it on an active square that indirectly targets your opponent's king. At this stage, black usually plays either bishop to c5 or knight to f6, but the general position and plans for white remain similar. Let's assume black plays bishop to c5. You proceed with pawn to c3, preparing to advance pawn to d4 in the near future. Black may choose various responses, such as pawn to h6. To prevent the idea of knight to g5 targeting the weak f7 square, a concept reminiscent of the fried liver attack. However, pawn to h6 is often considered a waste of time. Despite this, it offers white an interesting and somewhat underrated opportunity to execute plans revolving around the pawn to c3 setup, which continues to prepare for pawn to d4. In many variations, you will indeed play pawn to d4, but there is another idea enabled by the pawn on c3 that your opponent is very likely to overlook. This pawn also supports a push on the queenside with pawn to b4, driving away black's bishop from its active position. As the bishop retreats, you can continue pushing pawns forward to chase black's queenside pieces. You have two primary options: push the pawn to a4, setting up an attack on one of black's minor pieces on the next move. Immediately advance with pawn to b5, attacking black's knight. If black's knight is forced to move, it creates a significant inconvenience, as the knight is no longer able to defend the pawn on e5, potentially leaving it vulnerable. As the knight moves away, you are free to capture the pawn on e5. For instance, if the knight retreats to a5, it's already a favorable position for you. By pushing black's pieces to the queenside and to the edge of the board, you limit their activity. At this point, you can transition to a swift attack on the kingside. Begin with bishop takes f7, sacrificing the bishop to lure black's king forward. As the king captures, you follow up with knight takes e5, not only reclaiming the pawn but also delivering a check to the king. This aggressive play can lead to a winning position in just a few moves, catching your opponent completely off guard with your queenside pawn push. If black's king retreats to f8 or e7, you can continue with knight to g6, forking the king and the rook. On the following move, you capture the rook on h8, you continue attacking black's vulnerable king, leading to an easily winning position for white. Let's rewind a bit. If the king moves to e8 instead of f8 or e7, you can follow up with queen to h5, delivering a check. This sequence can resemble the scholar's mate. If the king moves elsewhere, you can keep attacking in various ways. For example, bishop to a3 delivers another check. After black responds with pawn to d6, you can finish the game with queen to f7, achieving a mate similar to the scholar's mate. Now, moving on to next plan. Black does not play pawn to h6 but instead makes the correct move knight to f6, developing the knight while attacking your pawn on e4. While the main move here is pawn to d4, it leads to a complicated game with many variations to memorize. Instead, I recommend the more modest-looking move pawn to d3, which still allows for very aggressive plans in the game. If you play the move pawn to d3, your opponent might underestimate it as a passive move and attempt to seize the initiative with pawn to d5. However, this turns out to be a significant error. After exchanging pawns on d5, you can follow up with the unexpected move queen to b3. This puts pressure on the knight on d5, which cannot retreat easily. If it moves, you'll capture the pawn on f7, launching a deadly attack on black's king. Black is left in a difficult position, forced to address the threat to the knight. If black tries moving the knight from c6 to e7 or a5, either to defend or counterattack, it doesn't matter, it loses in both cases. You respond with the strong move queen to b5, which delivers a check to the king, attacks the bishop, and also threatens the knight. On the next move, you will capture one of black's key pieces, gaining a decisive material advantage. Now, let's consider an alternative response. If black plays bishop to e6, attempting to defend the knight on d5, this also backfires. The move leaves the pawn on b7 undefended since the bishop is no longer on c8. You can proceed by capturing the pawn on b7, attacking both the knight on c6 and creating additional threats against black's position. Once again, black finds it inconvenient to defend the position. The queen cannot move away because it must continue guarding the rook in the corner. If the queen moves, you can capture the rook on a8. As for the knight, if black tries to move it to e7 or a5, it fails to the same tactic, queen to b5. This creates a double attack, targeting both the bishop and the king, while keeping the pawn you captured on b7. You will then capture the bishop, gaining a decisive material advantage. Now, let's move on to next plan. It's about understanding the underlying idea and executing it regardless of your opponent's exact responses. For example, if black plays normal-looking moves like pawn to d6, I recommend playing bishop to b3. While this move may appear modest, it has a clear purpose. First, it safeguards your bishop, an active piece that maintains long-term pressure on key squares where your opponent is likely to castle. This move sets the foundation for your continued attack. The bishop on b3 is a critical piece in the Italian game, providing a powerful long-term attacking potential, so it's important to keep it safe. One common idea for black is to play knight to a5, aiming to attack your bishop on b3. However, by positioning your bishop on b3, you ensure it has a safe retreat square. If black tries to attack it, you can simply slide the bishop back, making their efforts pointless. The first reason for playing bishop to b3 is to preserve this active piece. Secondly, it preemptively solves any defensive concerns. For instance, if black plays bishop to b6 to attack your bishop on b3 is already well protected, so their plan won't succeed. Lastly, this move sets a clever trap. Many opponents mistakenly believe that bishop to g4 is a strong way to attack your king's position. However, this move plays right into your hands, as it allows you to execute a highly aggressive attacking plan on the kingside. What if your opponent doesn't play bishop to g4? No problem, just relax, play solid Italian principles, and wait for the right moment. Most opponents will eventually play bishop to g4, and that's when you can take control. When they do, respond with pawn to h3, gaining valuable tempos by attacking their bishop. This creates an opportunity for you to develop a devastating kingside attack. Play pawn to h3, challenging black's bishop. In most cases, they will retreat the bishop as its primary purpose was to pin your knight on f3 to the queen. If they decide to exchange on f3, that works in your favor. When your queen recaptures on f3, it becomes a useful piece for launching an attack against black's kingside, where they are likely to castle. You can then follow up with bishop to g5, pinning their knight on f6 to their queen. This exchange of your opponent's bishop for your knight is generally favorable for you, so there's no downside. If the bishop retreats instead, proceed with knight to d2. Notice that at this point, you don't castle yet. The idea is to maneuver your knight to f1, followed by g3, to challenge black's bishop on g4 while also preparing for a kingside attack. This knight maneuver does more than just reposition your piece, it adds more attacking power to the kingside, which is your ultimate goal. Meanwhile, your opponent will likely castle, unaware of your plans. You continue with knight to f1, a move that might look strange at first because it seems like you're delaying development. However, this maneuver is part of a strong attacking plan. By repositioning your pieces, you steadily build up a powerful kingside assault, which your opponent won't anticipate. It might seem like white is making dubious moves by playing the bishop twice, but in reality, every move contributes to a clear plan of attacking black's castled king. Meanwhile, your opponent is often left unsure of how to respond. Sometimes they'll play pawn to h6 to prevent bishop to g5, but it doesn't matter, your plan remains effective. At this point, you have two powerful options. Continue your maneuver with knight to g3, attacking the bishop on h5. This is a solid and strategic choice, and we'll explore it more in a moment. Launch an aggressive kingside attack by advancing your pawns with pawn to g4. In both cases, you gain a tempo by attacking black's bishop on h5, which they might have considered an asset but turns out to be a liability. When the bishop is forced to retreat, you can choose to either build your attack gradually or accelerate it. For a gradual attack, reposition your knight to f5, steadily increasing pressure on black's kingside while bringing more pieces into play. Alternatively, you can go straight for the jugular with pawn to g5, attacking both the knight on f6 and the pawn on h6. This forces black to make uncomfortable decisions. If they capture your pawn, your bishop from c1 comes into play, pinning the knight on f6 to the queen and amplifying your attack. At this point, your pieces start to swarm black's king. Your bishop on b3 is also a key player, applying long-range pressure on critical squares, further supporting your relentless assault. This coordinated attack quickly becomes overwhelming for black.